Everyone, we're going to keep our discussion of DSM-5 structure and the other issues I mentioned in the previous video. Before we do that, I wanted to remind you of our first discussion board post homework, which is due before next class, because I want to have the opportunity to provide some collective feedback to everyone, and I'll be doing it in the video that I upload for that week. So please make sure to check the syllabus and complete that assignment, which will be our first assignment. So moving on to DSM-5 structure, I'm mostly going to focus on certain aspects of it because I provided you enough information to be able to understand how it's structured, and I'm quickly going to tie to the conversation of the developmental stages and processes of children and adolescents. So we're going to have 3 main sections and an appendix. The first section is the introduction or the basic section. That one is required for you to read. And section 2, we'll be reading it throughout the semester. Section 2 contains all the diagnostic criteria and codes. So each week what will happen is that we'll be learning about a new diagnosis, and you're going to have to read the criteria and other related information for that diagnosis. And section 3 provides some instruments/measures that you can use to assess diagnosis. You're also going to find in the course materials folders, I think there's a folder labeled assessment tools, so please make sure to check that. I don't normally discuss a lot of that in videos or in PowerPoints. I just mention them because I just want them to be shared with you so that you can use them in your field practices, right? So for pretty much all of the diagnosis, we'll be discussing this next 8 weeks. There's going to be some measures and instruments that I have provided, but also know that DSM-5 section 3 will have some measures and models that you can use to assess and evaluate in order for you to diagnose. The other important aspect related to children and adolescents and how DSM-5 works, in the old version of DSM-4, there was a category called disorders usually first diagnosed in infancy, childhood, and adolescence, and that is no longer the case in DSM-5. So DSM-5 is now guided by a lifespan developmental structure and classification of disorders, right? So pretty much in all of the diagnoses, all of the chapters you'll be reading within section 2, they will provide information related to how it is developed, right? What is the course and the development of each disorder. However, if we kind of want to know maybe where most of the early childhood and adolescence disorder lie, usually they're under the neurodevelopmental disorders childhood, right? So that is kind of like the chapter or the section, the area that DSM-5 has created for organizing the disorders that typically emerge or have an onset on childhood. However, this is not necessarily the case, as you're going to see other chapters, for example, the one related to behavioral conduct disorders, which also have onset in childhood and adolescence, that are not part of that neurodevelopmental category. And they can also emerge during childhood and adolescence. So do not take that rule strictly, because pretty much throughout all the DSM-5 section 2, each diagnosis is kind of organized to let you know what is the course and the development of the diagnosis. So it's just as a way to let you know that majority of the diagnoses that might emerge earlier in childhood are labeled under the area neurodevelopmental disorders, but other diagnoses are discussed in other chapters, which also emerge in those stages as well. Another important aspect that I want to let you know is the time that when you read this diagnosis, you're going to see that there's a lot of information, right? There's going to be information about the diagnostic criteria, how it forms, onset, risk and prognostic factors, other environmental factors, differential diagnosis. I have let you know in the announcement post, which states how to do well, or 5 tips on how to do well on this course. I have written down the specific areas or subtopics that I want you to read. There's a lot of information in DSM-5, and I don't want you to get overwhelmed with that. So some of the areas that I want you to focus on are going to be diagnostic criteria, I believe differential diagnosis, maybe course or development, and another one that I can't remember from the top of my head. So be sure to check that post or announcement before you go ahead and delve, because I don't want you losing your time and getting too anxious about the amount of information. Another aspect is that DSM-5 has multiple dimensions within each diagnosis. So not only are you going to see diagnostic criteria, but as part of the diagnostic criteria, you're going to be seeing specifiers, right? And specifiers tell you the severity, subtypes, if it kind of cross-cuts with other disorders. So for some diagnoses, you're going to see that there's going to be some information related to any specific or additional information that might be important within each diagnosis, right? I encourage you, I don't want to give too much information. I want to give you the space to start reading, and remember that each week you have the opportunity to write down questions, and I will answer the questions that you have. But keep in mind that you're going to see a lot of information within these sections. Why do I tell you that, right? Why do I tell you about this amount of information and how it relates to children and adolescents and diagnosing? Is because when I ask you to do your diagnostic formulations, you're going to have to take all these aspects in mind, right? You want to take important information such as the age of onset, the course, important factors, meaning risk and protective factors that the child and adolescent might have, what specifiers are met, if any subtypes, how severe it is. And it is important that you take into account that that is going to vary according to the developmental stage of the child. So that's why I have also included, and I want you to take a moment to peruse and check. I think there's a link I left in course materials related to childhood developmental stages. It's a CDC webpage, and very wonderful for you as a clinician, as a student, and for the parents you work with, because it provides basic information of where should the child and adolescent be to meet criteria for that developmental stage. Now remember, don't take this too seriously, because each individual is unique, and sometimes some individuals might develop some skills and abilities later in life. But it gives you kind of a parameter of where a child and an adolescent should be in a particular stage of their life. And I think that it's important when you consider making a particular diagnosis, because childhood and adolescence is such a large span, or encompasses so many ages, and there's so much variability across children and adolescents, that it's important for you to know, is this the right diagnosis at this time, and considering the attributes and characteristics of this child and adolescent. Also, I wanted to highlight that it's very important to keep in mind that diagnoses are very porous, right? Sometimes you're going to see that you think a child meets criteria for diagnosis. However, it seems that he or she might also meet criteria for for a different type of diagnosis. That's absolutely okay. And that is why I want you to read the section on differential diagnosis. Sometimes, and as we'll discuss when we talk about other disorders, sometimes disorders coexist. Sometimes disorders can live with each other, right? Like, for example, anxiety and depression, right? Or post-traumatic stress disorder and some other form of anxiety. So sometimes disorders can coexist. So it's important that you read very carefully the information that you have for each case, right? In terms of different aspects of the case. I don't want to get too much into that because I'm doing a separate video for case formulation, and so that you can see how it kind of relates. But it's very important that you keep in mind everything that you learn of the child and adolescents as you're making your initial interviews with parents and children before you make a decision. And it is okay to say, I'm uncertain, right? We have certain codes for that, as you have seen, non-otherwise specified, under-specified. Sometimes we don't have enough information to make a diagnosis within the first few sessions, and that is absolutely okay. What we don't want to do is mislabel or give a diagnosis of which we are uncertain. And another thing we can always do, and I'll discuss a little bit more of that in the case formulation, is that sometimes you can just put the main diagnosis, the one that you think fits the criteria the closest, and then maybe you could put other diagnoses as ruling them out, which means you're still actively considering them as potential diagnosis, but you need further information in order to make a final decision. So in a separate video, I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about case formulation and how all of these kind of relates, how like developmental aspects, diagnostic criteria, it all relates and comes into a diagnostic formulation. Very important video because your final examination is related to that. So I'll see you in a few minutes.